We are often taught that the Vatican is the vestibule of heaven. Yet, on the eve of All Hallows in 1501, within the shadowed halls of the Apostolic Palace, the boundaries between the sacred and the profane did not merely blur. They were obliterated under the watchful, unblinking gaze of Pope Alexander VI. A wedding feast transformed into a theatre of such calculated excess that history tried to erase it for centuries. This is not a rumour. It is the chilling testimony of Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies who recorded every gasp and every silence in his Liber Notarum. Before we unlock the archives, ensure you are subscribed to Crimson Historians and tell me, from which city are you witnessing this descent into darkness tonight? This is the true story of the Banquet of Chestnuts. To understand the nightmare that was about to unfold, one must first step away from the sanitized history books and walk into the rain-slicked streets of Rome in October of 1501. It was a city where the scent of incense in the churches could barely mask the stench of corruption rotting within the gutters. A duality that defined the very heart of the Christian world. At the center of this web sat the Vatican, not merely a place of worship, but a fortress of political machination that cast a long, suffocating shadow over all of Italy. And, within the Apostolic Palace, a man sat at his desk, the scratching of his quill against parchment, the only sound in a room heavy with secrets. This was Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, a man whose obsession with protocol and order made him the perfect chronicler for an era defined by chaos. In his diary, the Liber Notarum, Burchard didn't write with the flair of a poet, but with the cold, clinical precision of a coroner examining a corpse. And it is through his eyes that we see the Borgia family not as they wish to be seen, but as they truly were. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was a figure who seemed to have stepped out of a tragedy rather than a scripture. He possessed a charisma that was described by contemporaries as almost physical, a gravitational pull that drew men and women alike into his orbit, only to consume them. By the autumn of 1501, his ambition had outgrown the spiritual boundaries of the church and had manifested into a hunger for temporal power that knew no saturation. Beside him stood his son, Cesare Borgia, a man whose beauty was said to be as striking as it was terrifying, like a blade forged from the finest steel, polished to a mirror shine, yet destined only to draw blood. Together, they had turned the Vatican into a private court where the commandments were treated as mere suggestions, and where the lives of others were currency to be spent in the purchase of influence. And the most valuable currency they possessed was Lucrezia. We must pause here, for history has often painted Lucrezia Borgia as a villainess, a poisoner who kept venom in a hollow ring, a woman as depraved as her father and brother. But the records, particularly the dispatches of ambassadors who actually spoke with her, paint a far more tragic portrait. By the age of 21, she was not a predator, but a survivor of a psychological siege that had lasted her entire life. She was a woman who had learned that her beauty, her intellect, and her very name were not her own, but assets belonging to the Borgia dynasty. Her previous marriages had ended in annulment and murder, respectively, teaching her the brutal lesson that love was a liability in the halls of the Vatican. Now, in 1501, she found herself once again placed upon the altar of political necessity, betrothed to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. This union was not born of affection, nor even of mutual respect, but of a cold calculation to secure the Borgia influence over northern Italy. For Alfonso d'Este, the prospect of marrying into the Borgia family was akin to receiving a death sentence wrapped in silk. He was a man of pride, raised in a court that valued honor and lineage, and to be linked with the Borgias, a family rumored to commit unspeakable acts behind closed doors, was a humiliation he struggled to swallow. Yet, the power of Alexander VI was absolute. To refuse the Pope was to invite excommunication, war, and the annihilation of his house. And so, Alfonso travelled to Rome, moving toward the Vatican like a man walking toward a precipice, aware that the ground beneath him was crumbling, yet unable to turn back. As the wedding festivities approached, the atmosphere within the Apostolic Palace grew thick with a tension that Johann Burchard noted with increasing unease. It was not the joyous anticipation of a holy union, but the feverish excitement of a predator circling its prey. The Pope, normally a man of robust health, seemed possessed by a frantic energy, ordering preparations that went far beyond the standard protocols of a royal wedding. Servants were seen moving through the corridors at odd hours, carrying supplies into the private apartments of Cesare Borgia. Their eyes averted, their lips sealed by fear. Whispers began to circulate among the cardinals. Hushed conversations in darkened alcoves about the nature of the entertainment being planned. They spoke of invitations sent not to noble families, but to the shadowy figures of Rome's underbelly, to the keepers of the city's most exclusive brothels. Burchard, ever the stickler for rules, found himself marginalized, kept away from the inner planning of the banquet, a slight that he recorded with a mix of indignation and relief. He sensed, perhaps, that what was coming would defy not only the laws of the Church, but the laws of decency itself. The date was set for the last day of October, the Vigil of All Saints, a timing that carried a dark irony that would not have been lost on the pious population of Rome, on the very night when the faithful were preparing to honor the saints in heaven. The Vicar of Christ was preparing to unleash a spectacle of hell on earth. Imagine, if you will, standing in the shoes of Lucrezia Borgia in the days leading up to the banquet. The walls of the Vatican, adorned with the masterpieces of the Renaissance, frescoes depicting the salvation of mankind, must have felt like the bars of a gilded cage. She knew her father, she knew her brother, she understood the language of their smiles, which never quite reached their eyes, and she knew that their definition of celebration often involved the degradation of others. She moved through the palace like a ghost in her own life, draped in velvet and pearls that felt heavier than chains. Her silence a shield against the madness that surrounded her. She was to be the centerpiece of the event, the bride, the symbol of purity and future dynastic hope. Yet she was surrounded by men who viewed purity as a canvas upon which to paint their own perverse desires. The stage was thus set. The Apostolic Palace, usually a place of solemnity and prayer, was being transformed. Tables were arranged not for a pious meal, but for a revelry that would rival the feasts of ancient pagan Rome. The guest list included the highest princes of the Church, cardinals who wore the red of martyrdom, men who had sworn vows of celibacy and poverty, now expected to partake in a night of excess orchestrated by their supreme leader. It was a test of loyalty, a twisted game where complicity was the price of survival. As the sun began to set on the 31st of October, casting long, distorted shadows across the marble floors, the air turned cold, and the silence that fell over the Vatican was not one of peace, but of a bated breath before a scream. The doors to the Cesare Borgia's apartments were unlocked, the candles were lit, and the trap was finally sprung. The sun had long since surrendered the sky to the encroaching dark when the heavy oak doors of the Cesare Borgia apartments swung open to admit the guests inside. The scene was one of overwhelming opulence, a calculated assault on the senses designed to distract the mind from the moral precipice upon which they stood. The room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of 1,000 beeswax candles, their light dancing upon the gold-leafed ceilings and reflecting in the polished silver goblets that sat at every place setting. The air was thick, almost viscous, heavy with the scent of roasted meats, exotic spices brought from the farthest reaches of the known world, and the sweet, cloying aroma of heavy wines that flowed as freely as water. It was a setting fit for a king, or perhaps for a deity who had grown bored with the austere piety of heaven and sought the tactile pleasures of the earth. Seated around the massive U-shaped tables were the pillars of the Roman establishment, the cardinals in their scarlet robes, the very men who held the sacred trust of electing the next vicar of Christ. Alongside noblemen whose lineages stretched back to the time of the Caesars, they ate with a voracious hunger, tearing into pheasants adorned with their own feathers and wild boars roasted whole. Yet, beneath the veneer of conviviality, there was a palpable undercurrent of anxiety. Johann Burchard, observing from the periphery, noted that laughter in the room felt brittle, like dry parchment, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Eyes darted nervously toward the head of the table, where Pope Alexander VI sat not with the solemnity of a pontiff, but with the flushed, jovial demeanor of a pagan emperor presiding over a bacchanal. Beside him, Cesare Borgia remained an enigma, his expression unreadable, sipping his wine with a mechanical precision that suggested he was not a participant in the feast, but its conductor as the courses were cleared and the wine continued to pour, blurring the edges of reality for those in attendance. The atmosphere began to shift. It was a subtle transformation at first, a change in the tempo of the music, a darkening of the conversation, a feeling that the air in the room was being slowly sucked out. Alexander VI, leaning back in his chair with a smile that was both benevolent and predatory, raised a hand. The chatter died down instantly, silence sweeping across the hall like a cold wind. This was the moment the true purpose of the evening would be revealed. The moment when the mask of a wedding celebration would be allowed to slip, revealing the grotesque face beneath. At a signal from Cesare, the side doors, which had remained unobtrusive until now, were thrown open. A collective gasp, stifled but audible, rippled through the assembly. Entering the room were 50 women. They were not the common harlots one might find in the destitute alleys of the Trastevere, but courtigian honest, the honest courtesans, women of beauty, refinement, and reputation, who moved through the high circles of Roman society as companions to the powerful. They were dressed in gowns of silk and velvet that whispered against the stone floor, their hair woven with pearls and ribbons, their faces painted to perfection. Yet, despite their finery, there was a hesitation in their steps, a flicker of fear in their eyes that betrayed the coercive nature of their presence. They had been summoned by the Borgias, and one did not decline an invitation from the Vatican. Regardless of the cost to one's soul, the women were ushered into the center of the room, occupying the open space between the tables, creating a living tableau for the amusement of the Pope and his guests. Initially, they mingled with the cardinals and nobles, pouring wine, offering sweetmeats, and engaging in the witty repartee for which they were famous. It was a surreal juxtaposition. The sacred red of the church mixing with the profane silks of the night, the murmuring of prayers drowned out by the rustling of skirts and the clinking of glass. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the evening might remain within the boundaries of a scandalous, but ultimately harmless indulgence. But the Borgias had not orchestrated this gathering for mere conversation. Slowly, the dynamic of the room began to degrade. The heat from the candles and the press of bodies made the air stifling. The Pope, watching with the intensity of a man observing a gladiatorial contest, began to encourage a loosening of inhibitions. What started as a dance, elegant and refined, began to unravel. The musicians played faster. The wine was poured with more reckless abandon, and the commands from the high table became more specific, more humiliating. The women, trapped in the center of this ring of power, found themselves stripped of their agency. Piece by piece, the laughter of the men, fueled by alcohol and the heady rush of absolute authority, grew louder, coarser, echoing off the frescoed walls where saints looked down with painted eyes that seemed, for the first time in their existence, to be looking away in shame. It is crucial to understand the psychology of the men sitting at those tables. Why did the cardinals, princes of the church, not stand up and leave? Why did they not denounce this spectacle? The answer lies in the terrifying genius of Alexander VI. By forcing them to witness and eventually participate in this degradation, he was making them accomplices. He was binding them to him with chains of shared guilt. If they stayed, they were compromised. If they left, they were enemies. And in the Rome of the Borgias, to be an enemy was to disappear. So they sat, transfixed, their hands gripping their goblets until their knuckles turned white, paralyzed by a mixture of repulsion and a dark, forbidden fascination. Lucrezia and Alfonso, the nominal guests of honor, were relegated to the role of spectators in their own tragedy. Alfonso sat frozen, his face drained of color, realizing that this was not a celebration of his marriage, but a demonstration of his new family's total disregard for the laws of God and man. He was witnessing the dismantling of the moral universe he had been raised to revere. Lucrezia, conversely, sat with a stillness that was almost catatonic. She had seen the darkness of her family before, but never had it been paraded so openly, so brazenly. She avoided looking at the women in the center of the room, perhaps seeing in their forced smiles and fearful eyes a reflection of her own entrapment. She was a Borgia. Yes, but in that moment, she was as much a prisoner as the courtesans who were now being ordered to prepare for the next stage of the evening's entertainment. The turning point came when the order was given to clear the floor completely. The tables were pulled back, creating a wide arena of polished marble. Servants appeared with large woven baskets, heavy and brimming with their contents. They were not bringing more food, nor gifts for the bride and groom. They were bringing chestnuts, thousands of them. The servants began to scatter the nuts across the floor, the hard shells clattering against the stone with a sound like hail, a sound that would haunt the nightmares of those present for years to come. The noise was sharp, percussive, and relentless, drowning out the music, drowning out the whispers. It was the sound of the final barrier of decency being shattered. The stage was set for the Ballet of Chestnuts, a performance that Johann Burchard would struggle to describe in his diary, his pen shaking as he committed the details to history, knowing that what he was about to write would stain the legacy of the Vatican forever. The command, when it came, was not shouted, but delivered with a terrifying casualness that belied its depravity. Alexander VI, gesturing toward the sea of chestnuts that now littered the marble floor like the debris of a shipwreck, issued the decree that would define the night. The 50 women, who had stood until now as ornaments of the court, were ordered to divest themselves of the very finery that defined their station. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling of dignity, the rustle of heavy brocade falling away, the unlacing of bodices, the slipping of silk against skin. These sounds seemed amplified in the cavernous silence of the hall. They were to return to the state of Eve. But this was no Garden of Eden. It was a labyrinth of vice constructed by the Vicar of Christ. Within moments, the courtesans stood exposed, shivering not merely from the draught that snaked through the stone corridors, but from the freezing gaze of the most powerful men in Christendom. Then the game began. At a signal from the Pope, the candelabras were lowered, placing the light closer to the ground, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced upon the walls like demons celebrating a harvest. The women were ordered to crawl. They were to move on their hands and knees among the scattered chestnuts, weaving between the candelabras to collect the nuts, not with their hands, but in a manner that mimicked the beasts of the field. The sound that followed is perhaps the most haunting detail of the entire affair. It was a chaotic, hollow clattering, the sound of hard shells rolling against the unforgiving stone, mixed with the soft thud of flesh against marble and the laboured breathing of 50 souls forced to abandon their humanity for the amusement of their masters. Johann Burchard, whose pen had chronicled coronations and funerals with equal detachment, found his vocabulary stretched to its limit. He describes the scene not with the salaciousness of a voyeur, but with the horror of a witness to a sacrilege in his Liber Notarum. The Latin text is dry, yet the image it conjures is visceral. In sero fecerunt senam, capitis, manibus et pedibus nudis, naked on hands and feet. He noted that the Pope and Cesare did not simply watch. They adjudicated. They leaned forward from their high seats, pointing, laughing, and placing wagers on the agility of the women, treating them as one might treat racing hounds or prize horses. The prizes for this degradation were laid out for all to see. Silken tunics, pairs of shoes, velvet caps, trinkets of the material world offered in exchange for the destruction of the spiritual self. The sensory experience of the room became a suffocating fog. The smell of burning beeswax mixed with the metallic tang of spilled wine and the sweat of fear. The floor, usually the path for solemn processions of faith, became a chaotic arena of scrambling limbs. To the cardinals and nobles observing, the scene presented a monstrous conflict. These were men who preached the sanctity of the body as a temple, yet here they were, silent accomplices to its desecration. Some, emboldened by the wine and the Pope's own laughter, began to cheer, their voices merging into a cacophony that rose to the frescoed ceiling, where the painted saints maintained their eternal, silent vigil. Others, perhaps those with a shred of conscience remaining, turned their faces away, studying the dregs in their wine cups, desperate to be anywhere but here, yet too terrified to leave. And what of the central figures of this tragedy? Lucrezia Borgia sat as still as a statue, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, refusing to acknowledge the reality unfolding before her. It is a psychological defense known well to victims of trauma, dissociation, by separating her mind from the physical space. She could survive the unsurvivable. She was the daughter of the Pope. Yet, in this moment, she shared a kinship with the women on the floor. Both were pawns in a game where the rules were written by men who recognized no boundaries. Alfonso d'Este, the proud Duke-to-be, looked on with a mixture of disbelief and nausea. He was seeing the true face of the alliance he had been forced into. The chestnuts rolling across the floor were not just part of a game. They were the seeds of a deep, abiding hatred for the Borgias that would fester in his heart for the rest of his days. But Alexander VI was not finished. the crawling, the scrambling, the humiliation of the chestnut ballet. This was merely the prelude, as the women, exhausted and bruised, gathered the nuts and claimed their meagre prizes. The atmosphere in the room shifted again. The chaotic energy of the game settled into a heavier, darker mood. The air grew thick with a different kind of tension. Lust mixed with the absolute corruption of power. The Pope, flushed with the success of his spectacle, looked out over the room with a sense of immense satisfaction. He had proven that his will was law, that he could turn the Vatican into a theatre of the absurd and no lightning bolt would strike him down. It was then that the final, most damning command was issued. The prizes of silk and shoes had been awarded. But the true cost of the night was yet to be paid. The distinction between the observers and the participants was about to be erased entirely. Burchard records that the carnal intercourse that followed was not a private act of passion, but a public transaction. Men, stripped of their inhibitions by the Pope's sanction, descended into the arena. The details of what followed are best left to the shadows where they belong. But the essence of the horror was this. Within the walls of the Apostolic Palace, under the roof of St. Peter, the sacred laws of the Church were inverted. The Vatican had become, in every sense, an anti-church, a place where sin was not confessed, but celebrated. Yet, even amidst this descent into madness, there was a specific ritual that Alexander required, a final act to seal the political alliance that was the ostensible reason for this gathering. The attention of the room turned once more to the high table, to the trembling couple who had hoped, perhaps, that they might be spared the final indignity. But in the world of the Borgias, there is no mercy, only leverage. The chestnuts had been gathered, the laughter had died down, and now, the silence that fell was the silence of the executioner's block. The Pope turned to Alfonso and Lucrezia, his eyes gleaming with a terrible expectation. The night was not over. The verdict of the triple consummation was about to be delivered. The night had already surpassed the boundaries of decency. But Alexander VI possessed a definition of power that required total submission. The chestnut ballet had reduced the courtiers to voyeurs and the courtesans to animals. Yet one final act remained to complete the Borgia triumph. It was not enough for Alfonso d'Este to marry into the family. He had to be broken by it. The Pope, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, turned his gaze to the newlyweds. The room fell into a silence so profound that the sputtering of the dying candles sounded like gunshots. The command was given. The marriage was to be consummated, now, here, and not merely once, but 3 times, to ensure that no legal loophole, no claim of impotence or non-completion could ever be used to annul this union, as it had been used against Lucrezia's first husband. This was the final verdict. It was a demand that stripped the act of marital intimacy of any romance, any privacy, or any sanctity, reducing it to a biological performance for the satisfaction of the state. Alfonso stood, his face a mask of grey ash. He was a man trained in the arts of war, prepared to face death on a battlefield, but nothing in his education had prepared him for this distinct brand of Vatican warfare. He looked at the guards, stationed at the doors, their hands resting easily on their hilts. He looked at Cesare, whose cold, reptilian stare dared him to refuse, and finally, he looked at Lucrezia. She did not weep, she did not beg, she simply rose, her movements mechanical, a marionette whose strings were being pulled by her father's invisible hand. The witnesses, the cardinals, the ambassadors, the nobles, did not leave. They could not. To look away would be an insult to the Pope. To leave would be treason. And so, the great hall of the Apostolic Palace, beneath the gaze of the painted apostles, became a courtroom where the evidence was flesh and the verdict was written in shame. Johann Burchard, faithful to his duty, recorded the event with a clinical brevity that chills the blood. He notes that the couple was escorted to the bower, yet the privacy was an illusion, the curtains left open, the eyes of the court fixed upon them. The consummation was verified, counted, and applauded. A grotesque parody of the wedding night. 3 times, the records state, 3 times Alfonso d'Este was forced to prove his utility to the Borgia ambition. 3 times, Lucrezia was reminded that her body was merely territory to be conquered and flagged. When it was finally over, when the Pope was satisfied that the union was irrevocable in the eyes of God and man, the dawn was beginning to break over Rome. The grey light of All Saints' Day filtered through the high windows, illuminating a scene of wreckage, crushed chestnuts, spilled wine, sleeping bodies, and a silence that felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. Alfonso and Lucrezia emerged from the ordeal not as husband and wife, but as 2 survivors of a shipwreck, bound together by the same jagged piece of driftwood, drifting in a sea of trauma that would separate them forever. Alfonso d'Este left Rome soon after. He returned to Ferrara a changed man, carrying a silence within him that no one dared to probe. He would eventually become a respected duke, a patron of the arts, and a fierce commander of artillery. But those who knew him whispered that he never truly returned from the Vatican. He had left a part of his soul on the marble floor of the Apostolic Palace, crushed alongside the chestnuts. As for Lucrezia, she spent the remainder of her life trying to wash away the stain of her name. In Ferrara, she became known for her piety, wearing a hair shirt beneath her velvet gowns, praying for hours until her knees bled, perhaps seeking absolution for sins she'd been forced to commit. When she died young, at 39, she left behind a legacy of charity, yet history would always remember her first as the daughter of the Borgia. The architects of that night met their own ends. Alexander VI died less than 2 years later, his body swelling and turning black in the summer heat. A gruesome demise that many Romans whispered was the devil coming to collect his due. Cesare Borgia, the prince who would be king, died alone in a minor skirmish in Spain, stripped of his power, his body stripped naked by looters and left in the mud. A final, ironic echo of the degradation he had inflicted upon others. But the Banquet of Chestnuts remains. It survives in the dusty pages of Johann Burchard's Liber Notarum, a testament to what happens when absolute power is divorced from absolute morality. It stands as a monument to the silence of good men. For remember, the horror of that night was not just in the commands of a mad pope, but in the obedience of the cardinals, the nobles, and the witnesses who stood by and watched. They prioritized their safety over their dignity, their positions over their humanity. So, as we close the archives on the year 1501, do not ask yourself how such a thing could happen in the house of God. Ask yourself, if you had been in that room, standing in the candlelight, surrounded by the most powerful men in the world, would you have spoken up, or would you, too, have simply watched? The past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting for someone to read the testimony. I am the Crimson Architect. Sleep well, if you can.